Thank you again, Dr. Fuller, for coming and speaking today. My name is Claire Greenstein. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the Sam Nunn School, and it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, our keynote address from Dr. Milada Vachudova. She is an associate professor of political science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she served as the director for the Center of European Studies and also their Global Studies program. She researches and teaches about the democratization of post-communist Europe, the enlargement of the EU, and also the impact of international actors on domestic politics.
So it's a great pleasure to be here. Those of you in the back, there's some seats right up here just waiting for you. I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Come on up, don't be shy. You're welcome to leave halfway through my talk. I won't mind at all. I'm always leaving through halfway stuff. So it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you to Georgia Tech. Thank you to Claire Greenstein and Alistair Young. It's really a pleasure to speak on this, the 30th anniversary of the fall of the wall. I really do see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 more seats up here. Come on, you guys, don't be shy. Don't be more comfortable. So I was just thinking about 30 years, because 30 years ago was such a euphoric time. And looking over this audience, I can see that about half of this audience remembers 1989, and about half of this audience was not born yet in 1989. That's about how I see this. Well, I was exactly 20 years old 30 years ago, and my parents were refugees from Czechoslovakia. They had been camping in the United States. They came in the fall of 1967, and the plan was to stay here for a year. They were able to leave because of the Prague Spring. There was a pro-democracy movement in Czechoslovakia in 1967 and 1968 that saw sort of an opening up of society, a lifting of restrictions, of censorship, and of travel restrictions. So my parents, after over 20 years, were finally able to get an exit permit. Back then, the problem wasn't getting a visa to enter the United States or Canada. The problem was getting permission to leave the Soviet bloc. And so my father was very ambitious. He had a little French Renault 4. He loaded it up with camping equipment, canned food, paintings, because he had become an artist. He wasn't able to be a professor in communist Czechoslovakia. At the last minute, got permission to bring my older brother, who was about 3 at the time, and they drove to Gdańsk, and this little car full of camping equipment and everything was loaded into a grain ship that was going to Canada for grain. And they were the only passengers, and the plan was to drive around and camp through Canada and the US for a year, and then ditch the car and fly home. They were camping in Big Bend, Texas, when the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia in August of 1968. And they heard about it from the ranger who came running to their campsite to tell them that they should come listen to the news. And it took about another year for them to actually decide to seek asylum in the United States. What many of us know but don't have to experience is the fact that making the choice to leave one's home is never a choice that people make lightly, especially when it's a choice to seek asylum, knowing you're not going to be able to go home. So I grew up outside of Seattle, Washington, with parents waiting to go home when the regime would change in Czechoslovakia. And I wasn't very interested in Eastern Europe. I spoke fluent Czech. I had the full semi-nationalist indoctrination from great patriots, but it was only when I was studying in Paris in 1989, and in 1989 this incredible transformation happened peacefully. I was able to travel back to Prague for the Velvet Revolution and kind of catch the tail end of that. And that's what began my interest in not just political change in post-communist Europe, but also the question of how Western and Eastern Europe would be put back together again, and what kind of a new transatlantic architecture would be put in place, including the expansion of NATO and the European Union. When I'm teaching, I'm often struck by the fact that from my generation, we had this incredibly positive moment in world politics, this completely unexpected and peaceful collapse of the Soviet bloc and collapse of communism that sort of defined our worldview. Whereas for students now, it's a very different kind of series of events in world politics. And of course, in the early 1990s, when we were looking so positively across the political changes in Europe, we were often glossing over the fact that there was a huge failure of the US and the Europe in the bloody civil wars in Yugoslavia. But overall, this was a time of euphoria, and quickly a question of why and how different countries in post-communist Europe would be making those political changes or transformation. And in the early 1990s, what we often thought was that all of these countries would be going towards liberal democracy and the free market economy. The question was only a matter of speed. So maybe Poland and Czechoslovakia would go very quickly, but Russia and Georgia and who knows, Tajikistan, these other countries would be on that same road. And by the end of the 1990s, we realized that that was not the case, and that for many countries in post-communist Europe, they had really changed one kind of authoritarian system for another kind of authoritarian system. So that was the first kind of sobering realization. Another sobering realization was, I think, that for American foreign policy, 1989 might not have taught us the best lesson, because what we saw in East Germany, what we saw in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, and elsewhere, was that if you bring down the totalitarian regime and give people free and fair elections very quickly, you're going to get a lovely government. You're going to get a government that's pro-American, pro-Western, that wants to join the EU. A revolution that was really about imitating the West, not about going somewhere new, about joining the West or return to Europe. And I think that that was wonderful where it happened, but it hasn't been our experience in other parts of the world. That said, I think there are three successes, before I get to the gloomy part, and I will get to the gloomy part. I think there are three successes that really are worth dwelling on. And today, with so much attention to democratic backsliding and the rise of populism, it's important to stop and remember that. So three things. First, in 1989, we saw the transformation not just from a totalitarian, authoritarian political system to liberal democracy, but at the same time an incredibly difficult transformation from a communist, state-controlled economy to the free market economy. And many citizens of Eastern Europe suffered tremendously in the early 1990s. They saw their standard of living actually drop precipitously. They had hugely increased insecurity. And there were quite a few people who thought, well, this is not good, because these countries are transitioning to democracy, most of them for the very first time, at the same time that they're transitioning to the free market with this incredible economic hardship on the part of the citizens. So won't many citizens of Eastern Europe reject liberal democracy because it comes hand in hand with this economic insecurity and dislocation? Not so different from the late 1930s, for example, where in Western Europe, many citizens turned away from liberal democracy and looked at Nazi Germany and thought, hey, this guy's not nice, but he seems to have a better system. Well, the good news is that that did not happen. And while today we talk a lot about political attitudes in Eastern Europe and are they really supporting democracy or not, but in the 1990s, many citizens in Eastern Europe were very supportive of democracy, even as they were going through this very difficult economic period. The second good news is that, at least for the countries that have joined the EU, the economic transformation has been successful. There's a lot, and it's really important to emphasize how much variation there is. So when I talk about what I call the EU East, the countries that have joined the European Union, today we see the Czech Republic surpassing Spain in terms of GDP. We see tremendous increase in terms of mobility of young people, know-how, entrepreneurship, which isn't to say there aren't quite a lot of problems, but overall the economic transformation in many places has been a success. And finally, EU enlargement. The fact that very hesitantly at first, in the early 1990s, the EU was completely unprepared to expand to new members, but hesitantly and over time, it's put in place a pre-accession process. It got many more applicants than it was expecting. In the early 90s, enlargement was really just supposed to be about Germany's immediate neighbors, and let's make sure we let them in. But when they set up a process where countries could ask to be in the pre-accession queue, suddenly they had many more countries wanting to join that queue than they had expected. And EU enlargement worked quite well in the sense that it did inspire two things. It inspired political parties that wanted to be elected in the 1990s to be more moderate. So in many countries, political parties who had been using ethnic nationalism to appeal to voters, who were talking about economic transformation but actually stealing a huge amount of resources and money, they moderated to a certain extent to be able to say to the voters that they could get the country into the European Union. And the other way was just policies, right? The EU enlargement process with the acquis communautaire, but also the Copenhagen criteria, asked candidate states to make changes. These changes were important in things like ethnic minority rights, LGBTQ rights, worker safety, environmental regulation. There's a whole list. It is really a phenomenal and important fad in European Union scholarship right now to blame the EU for absolutely everything, and that's the same as the populists. So EU scholars and populists are the same in that one way. They blame the EU for everything. I recently heard that the EU was also at fault for the collapse of feminism in Eastern Europe. I don't know. But I think that there are times when the EU has contributed negatively, like in certain kinds of corruption. That's absolutely the case. But overall, the picture is a positive one, and there are many different examples that we can point to. Another way to think about it is the counterfactual. Where would the Czech Republic be today without EU accession? Where would Romania be? And especially in terms of how the state treats the citizen. There are ways in which the state is much more constrained in its treatment of the citizen. So those are the successes. Now let's talk about some of the current difficulties. There are problems now in all three of these areas: liberal democracy, with the rise of populism and democratic backsliding, problems in terms of the economic transformation, both corruption, but also the impact of neoliberalism and rising income inequality, and three, problems with the EU enlargement process, especially with what's just happened to North Macedonia. How many of you have been following North Macedonia? Okay, well, at the end of my talk, I will try to convince you all that this is the most important thing happening right now. Okay, so first let's talk about liberal democracy. And I think a good place to start is a definition of populism. So the rise of populism is what everyone is writing about now and talking about, and it is interesting because politicians have been populist for a long time. This is not a new phenomenon. What's new is targeting so precisely the establishment cabal. So all populists say to the people, vote for me and I am going to protect you. I'm going to fight for your interests against the establishment cabal. But there are differences in how populists define the establishment cabal. There are left-wing populists and right-wing populists. So left-wing populists tend to look at it more from a class struggle kind of perspective. So, the people versus the very wealthy. You could think about Greece or Spain having more of this kind of left-wing populism. right-wing populists. I call them ethnopopulists. I use some of the work of Professor Erin Jenny at the CEU. Right-wing populists define the elite establishment cabal as also being the other, in league with ethnic minorities, immigrants, refugees, foreigners, professors in the West who mean them no good. All kinds of different folks get pulled into this establishment cabal, but it usually has an ethnic, racial, and religious component to it. And this kind of ethnopopulism is unfortunately what we are seeing today in East Central Europe, in Poland, in Hungary, the Czech Republic, also in Austria, in Switzerland, in the United Kingdom, with Boris Johnson, and in the United States. The next question then is, why is ethnopopulism related to democratic backsliding? Why is it that these political parties that get elected on appealing to the people against this establishment cabal then need to get into power and start eroding democratic institutions? And there seems to be a very common recipe or playbook. And that is that they portray themselves as being for the people. Well, the people are defined as the majority, whether they are really the majority or just whatever majority they were able to get to at the last election. If any of you follow British politics, you know the next prime minister is very unlikely to have gotten anywhere close to 50% of the vote of UK citizens. So they're for the people. The people is defined as the majority in the last referendum or the last rigged or not rigged election, and they're then defined as against ethnic and other minority rights. Baun in Hungary has really pioneered this, saying, 51% of Hungarians agree with me, and therefore the Hungarian state has the right to discriminate against the minority. So the attack on any kind of counter-majoritarian institutions and ethnic and minority rights. The reason this happens, I think, is because ethnopopulists, the way they concentrate power and the way they exploit the economy, they don't want to lose the next elections. And so they use the fact that they're speaking for the people to try to take apart the checks and balances, which are going to make it easier for them to win the next elections. Now, there's a bunch of irony here. The first irony is that many of the populists that have been elected, that are incumbents now in the East and the West, and so this is not just a post-communist phenomenon, they are actually working for the wealthiest in society. So while they get elected on a platform for the people, they are actually, when in power, often working for the wealthiest. And this, ironically, these policies then increase income inequality and make the people even more unhappy, and presumably may make it more likely that they vote for the populists again. And recently I was at a conference with Professor Ian Manners, who works on the rise of populism and climate change. And one of the things which was so interesting about his talk was showing how, in fact, neoliberalism, which is very distinct from liberal democracy, right? Liberal democracy is a political system with checks and balances and counter-majoritarian institutions, free and fair elections. Neoliberalism is about deregulating the economy, essentially, right? But in many places, the populists are now benefiting those who want even more deregulation. And those folks often have a strong connection to climate change. So the petrochemical industry, if you look in Hungary, if you look in the United Kingdom, you see that those kind of closest, those funding these populists are actually often very close to the petrochemical industry. Boris Johnson's cabinet full of climate change deniers. So this actually leads us to the big question, right? Why this rise of people, of voters, voting for ethnopopulists? And in Poland and Hungary, this has been really a shock because Poland and Hungary were really the vanguard, and the Czech Republic. These were the countries in the 1990s that were the first. They had the most beautiful sort of transition from communism, TV-ready dissidents, Václav Havel, who had an enormous amount of a great following in the West and in the United States. And these are the countries that really had anchored that transformation to liberal democracy in post-communist Europe. And so to find them leading now in terms of democratic backsliding is really a shock, not to mention, the United Kingdom. Did we ever think this would happen to the United Kingdom? And I won't talk about the US. Not enough time. In a way, these countries that led the democratization effort are now leading the pack in terms of democratic backsliding. And so the question is why? And for Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic, I think part of the story is the lack of a contested transition in the 1990s. I think places like Slovakia, even Romania and Bulgaria, that had much more of a contested transformation where you had authoritarian parties still trying to stay in control in the 90s and often succeeded in some ways. I'm not going to say anything great about democracy in Bulgaria and Romania, but I think in a way the fact that the 90s weren't contested gave these ethnopopulists a really interesting platform, which is that many of them argue that the transition in '89 was some kind of an elite plot. And this is most well developed in Poland, where the current government of peace and the kind of media and cultural ecosystem that they operate in claims that the Round Table in Poland was actually a stitch-up between Solidarity, who were being paid by the communist, and the communist regime. And the peace in Poland, and also Orbán in Hungary, present themselves as they're going to finally sweep away the communist practices and the communist elites. But the great irony here, and there are many ironies, is that as they're governing now, they are employing exactly the same tactics that the communist regime was employing in the 70s and the 80s. Today in Hungary, we don't even have democracy. We refer to Hungary now as an authoritarian regime. There's absolutely no free media, no ability to associate freely. Many civil society groups have been shut down or they're currently harassed. The Helsinki Foundation, the CEU have been forced to leave. And the complete absence of independent media means that it's very difficult for any opposition parties to gather momentum, although they have had some successes lately. So this is striking, right? This is shocking. And so why? And I think the rise of ethnopopulist parties, the reasons are similar in East and West. I think the attitudes in the East are maybe less, citizens have less of an attachment to democracy. I think citizens in the East are certainly more open to racism. They have less experience with multiculturalism. I think when confronted with democratic backsliding, institutions in the West are stronger than in the East. But I think the rise of the parties, the reasons why they've become more popular are very similar in East and West. And so there's two things. There's pull factors and there's push factors. The pull factors are the ones that most of my colleagues write about. And that is just talking about the changes for middle class and working class citizens in Europe and the United States. Talking about the rise with globalization, the rise of economic insecurity, feeling of being left behind, feeling of threat from immigration, which was certainly exacerbated or amplified in Europe with the 2015 refugee crisis, and a general failure of representation. The idea being that left-wing parties in the 1980s or 90s, 2000s, when they should have been representing the kind of bread and butter interests of working class and middle class voters who are worried about wages and job security, they had instead more shifted to identity issues and had lost these voters who were feeling more and more insecure. And the far right and ethnopopulist parties were there to kind of give them a solution and also to really politicize immigration. So you can think of it as a sort of failure of representation on the part of centrist and especially social democratic parties. I think that there's a lot of truth to that, but I also think there's a push factor. And that is that these ethnopopulist parties have learned from one another and they play dirty. The way that they campaign, the way that they appeal to voters, the way that they buy up the media, manipulate the media, manipulate social media with the help of Russia, which is something they all have in common. It's very hard for mainstream parties to push back against that. And they engage in a really, I think, impressive amount of learning. We had Orbán came first in Hungary, and it wasn't just that PiS in Poland and Babiš in the Czech Republic and others were watching him. They were actually like going to Budapest to see how he did it, and he was giving them advice. Orbán himself was getting advice from others. Putin was helping him. He has a good relationship with Erdogan. Netanyahu was always there to help him. And so there's a kind of ethnopopulist cabal there as well, right? And they have a kind of playbook of let's try everything and let's see what works, and they learn from one another about what works. And I think that it's not that the racism and the economic insecurity wasn't there, but they amplified it and they found ways to activate it. My home country, the Czech Republic, I feel like is a really striking case in point, because this is a little country that is incredibly prosperous right now. There's a labor shortage in Prague. Of course, there's a difference between urban and rural areas, and there are rural areas where people feel left behind. But the ethnopopulist leader who's in power there, Andrej Babiš, he's an oligarch who one day founded a party, bought up the equivalent of the Washington Post and the New York Times, bought the radio, bought a TV station, and he controls some 350 companies in the Czech Republic. So there's now an app, actually. You can go to the grocery store and try to fill your grocery basket with goods that aren't produced by Babiš's company. You have to scan each thing, but it's actually quite difficult because he controls so much of the Czech agricultural, chemical, and other markets. And what's striking is that he and the president, who's incredibly pro-Russian, have managed to just saturate the Czech population, along with social media posts, etc., and some very far right-wing parties, with the threat of refugees. There are no refugees in the Czech Republic. There are none. But the last election was fought almost entirely on this threat that the EU is going to force the Czech Republic to take these refugees from the Middle East, and that these people are then going to destroy Czech culture and cause a security problem. And I think the Czechs are an interesting, case study because of the change in attitudes, which has been so dramatic, and just this kind of closed area case. And you see this at a time when there are tens of thousands of Ukrainians coming to the Czech Republic for work, but they're not politicized at all. It's just the brown-skinned Muslim refugees and immigrants who are not actually in the Czech Republic and won't be. So I was surprised. I didn't expect that this kind of ethnic scapegoating and ethnic nationalism would come all the way to the Czech Republic. So how do we make sense of this? I mean, first of all, I've said already, I don't think the difference in the East and West is different in terms of how these parties have risen. I think the difference is in the reaction. It's clear that in Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic, these younger democratic institutions, the checks and balances, are having a harder time responding to the attempt or the successes of eroding counter-majoritarian institutions. I think in Hungary in particular, we have to ask ourselves, how could the European Union kind of let things go so far? And that is the real sort of elephant in the room in terms of how could members of the European Union now be not liberal democracies or be actually authoritarian regimes. And with the case of Hungary, it was that Orban was a very well-connected, respected, known politician in the EU. The Fidesz party is a member of the European People's Party, which needed Fidesz's votes in the European Parliament to be the largest party. And so for a long time, it was sort of like the frog in the hot water. Slowly, the water's getting hotter and hotter and hotter. And by the time I think EU leaders really realized how bad the undermining of democratic institutions in Hungary had become, it was sort of too late. And it is true that the EU has been more vigilant and more proactive in trying to curb those democratic abuses in Poland. But it's an open question about whether that external pressure just helps the incumbent populists, because of course they will have a wonderful time saying, the big bad EU, they're trying to destroy us, they're trying to control us, it's like the Soviet Union, we're not going to trade Moscow for Brussels. And the European Union has a hard time defending itself in any country, right? We know that the European Union, all over Europe, politicians take credit for everything that goes well, and anything that goes poorly, they blame on the European Union. This has become common practice. And in a place like Hungary and Poland, it's amplified. Adam Michnik, one of the solidarity activists, was at UNC recently, and he was very much arguing against the EU intervening in Polish politics, thinking it would just strengthen the incumbent populists. While others have argued that this is a moment where the European Union stands to lose its soul in a way, right? Because it's always been the case that liberal democracy hasn't been well defined among EU member states, but it's always been assumed that the European Union is a club of liberal democracies, with tremendous variation in terms of counter-majoritarian institutions and, for example, protection of minority rights. But one of the impacts that we see already on the European Union, and that I think is quite striking, is that Hungary and Poland, the Czech Republic, and sometimes joined by other member states, have been able to transform the EU's foreign policy already. And they've done so by Orban by kind of being ready to work with whatever, I call them darn illiberal rent-seeking thugs. Whatever thug in the international system will give him something, he'll do something in return, right? So he'll speak out against EU sanctions of Russia, although he hasn't vetoed them yet, in exchange from help from Putin. He's been helping block security screening for investments from China in exchange for investment from China. He has watered down or blocked EU foreign policy that's perceived as being pro-Palestinian in exchange for Netanyahu coming and hugging him on national TV after he ran the most anti-Semitic campaign that anyone has run in Europe since World War II. All of Budapest was covered with huge billboards, the whole country, huge billboards that just said, "Stop Soros." And there you had Soros caricatured holding the puppet strings with domestic opposition leaders and also members of the international community. And what basically Orban said, you have to vote for me to stop Soros, who has a plan to destroy European culture by importing 1 million Muslims into the EU every year. This was what the campaign was. This is what happens when you have no independent media and when the government is able to use the state and the state-controlled media to say whatever it wants to the voters. And so we have already a kind of erosion of the EU in terms of its foreign policy, because so much of the EU's foreign policy, it's about normative power, right? People wanting to be like the European Union. And also material power that has included in the accession process and also in trade agreements requirements to, for example, include civil society. Now, those requirements aren't always met. There are many trade agreements that the EU has had historically, say with Mubarak's Egypt, etc., that had beautiful language about civil society and independent media that wasn't all lived up to, but at least it was there. And in many cases, civil society groups had to have some role in these different, talking about these different agreements because the EU made that a stipulation. So then what happens when you have members of the EU, like Hungary today, where there is no independent civil society anymore? It's basically only government-sanctioned civil society. This is would be in the medium to long term a tremendous transformation. The EU could become just another block of countries that acts on the world stage in its economic and strategic interest, losing that piece that this is a collection of liberal democracies. But before we got there, it would be very contentious, and I think would rip the European Union apart. Now, there are people who disagree with me. Andy Moravchik and I argue about this all the time, so if you want to see the opposite view, go. I think he's written it up by now, but he thinks it doesn't matter, right? That EU is just about bargaining about member states, among member states, and if some of the smaller member states are authoritarian regimes, it really doesn't matter. So I hope he's right, actually. I don't think he's right, but I do. All right, so now I just want to, I'll take some questions, but before I do, I want to come back to North Macedonia. Remember North Macedonia. So North Macedonia, you know, for the longest time, I argued that the European Union accession process was the most powerful foreign policy tool that the EU has. And I think I was right. I think in the 1990s and the 2000s, joining the EU is a foreign policy tool that the United States doesn't have. Nobody in the world has, because countries want to join the European Union. They see the benefits of joining as tremendous, both in terms of being protected by EU rules, not being bullied by EU members, and being on the inside of the EU's single market. The United Kingdom, Boris Johnson should have read my book, because pretty soon they're going to be sitting there remembering why it's really, really good to be inside the European Union, and why the countries that are outside of it are really inside of it for all intents and purposes, right? Switzerland, Norway. And so because the benefits of joining the EU are, let's say, tremendous, the requirements of joining the EU could be very substantial. You could ask countries to adopt 150,000 pages of the acquis communautaire. You could ask them to make changes also to things like citizenship, ethnic minority rights, and so forth. It was an imperfect process. Oftentimes the only things that got addressed were the things that, the fires, so to speak, so citizenship for the Roma in the Czech Republic, or ethnic minority rights for Hungarians in Slovakia. But things did improve, and they were able to ask for improvements in how the state treated citizens and how the state respected minority rights. But it had to operate as a meritocracy, right? You couldn't expect that political parties and governments would spend years meeting these very substantial requirements of joining the EU, only to be told at the end of the process that, oh, sorry, EU enlargement isn't popular right now, so you can't join. And in a way, that's what happened with Turkey, right? There was a moment where Sarkozy said, well, Turkey's never joining unless it passes a referendum of the French people, which was a pretty good signal to the Turks that they should really not get their hopes up, right? Because it wouldn't pass a referendum in France. So what would be the point of Turkish politicians and parties and governments spending years and years satisfying all these requirements? But for the Western Balkan states, this process has continued to work in the sense that the populations of the Western Balkan states that are still in the membership queue, Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, Northern Macedonia, and Bosnia, they want very much to join the EU, and there would be huge benefits to them joining. And so governments were doing and there's huge variation, okay? But North Macedonia is a country that actually had already been told, you're not moving forward because of the Greek veto. The Greeks, this was like the most ridiculous ridiculous thing the Greeks did, right? For over 20 years, they vetoed Northern Macedonia moving forward in both NATO and the EU because they didn't like the name Macedonia. They thought that this meant sort of a territorial ambitions on Greek territory, that this was disrespectful of the Greek Hellenistic past and was trying to appropriate Greek history by these Slav Macedonians. And I would speak at a conference somewhere and I would say Macedonia, and some Greek diplomat would start pounding his fists on the table, stand up and make me apologize. This went on for years because you weren't allowed to say Macedonia. You had to say former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. Well, this bullying and humiliation eventually helped bring in an ethnopopulist government in Macedonia by Nikola Gruevski, who basically said one day, fine, I'm not going towards the EU, I might as well steal as much as possible. And he did. He was the most incredibly corrupt authoritarian, and he even had this project, because then he really wanted to stick it to the Greeks. That was how he was getting votes, right? Okay, I'm standing up to the Greeks. He transformed, how many of you have been to Skopje? No. You're gonna go. He transformed central Skopje into looking like something between the British Museum and Las Vegas. These incredible, 400 plus enormous statues talking about Macedonia's Hellenistic past. All male, by the way, all male. And these facades, these neoclassical facades everywhere. It really is crazy now. Anyway, to make a long story short, the Macedonian opposition, civil society groups, all worked together to put on these enormous, tremendous protests, and with the help of the European Union and with the help of the leak of tapes, managed to have a transition government and then new elections, and the pro-European, pro-democratic opposition won those elections. And the EU was very helpful in brokering all this, and it was great. And the first thing the new government of Zaev did was start negotiating with the Greeks. And they agreed to change the name from Macedonia to North Macedonia. And so now the Greeks have lifted their veto on North Macedonia moving forward. And yet Macron, 2 weeks ago, the French President Macron said no. Even though everybody, the Commission, the Council, everyone has said that North Macedonia has done a tremendous amount of work to move to open negotiations with the EU, including this humiliating process of changing its name to please the Greeks. What more could you ask for? And now the French President Macron has said, no, this isn't the right time for the EU to enlarge, and I refuse to open negotiations with Macedonia. Now, opening negotiations is not the same thing as membership. I think I know what happened. I think it was because Orban is causing so many problems in the European Union. Macron is thinking, I don't want any more Orbans, right? I don't want any more Hungaries in the EU. Finally getting rid of the British. We could finally do something here in the EU. That might be what he's thinking, but in fact, by not letting North Macedonia open negotiations, he's almost certainly guaranteed that that country will go back to an authoritarian regime. And in fact, this will be very useful for Orban's friends throughout the Balkans. So it is a terrible, terrible, terrible mistake on the part of the EU. And I am someone who has always been very positive about the EU pre-accession process and the way that the EU has handled enlargement, with some exceptions like Cyprus. And so this is really sad. So if any of you diplomats can help with another cable back to the French, that would be great. Okay, so I will end on an optimistic note in that I think Macron will change his mind. I think that the reality that these Western Balkan states need to continue moving towards EU membership, because if they don't, they will cause as many problems for the EU one way or the other. It's a sort of security question for them. And I think that the pendulum will swing back. I think in Poland, for example, where we have strong opposition parties and strong civic movements. In the Czech Republic, remember Babiš, this evil oligarch, We have the biggest demonstrations now since the Velvet Revolution. There were 300,000 people demonstrating in Prague in June, and there'll be another 300,000 or more demonstrating in a couple of weeks for the anniversary. So I think that while we see the rise of sort of ethnopopulism and hate-mongering and scapegoating, all that, we also see the rise of groups that and opposition parties and civic movements that are countering that. We saw that in the European parliamentary elections, where there is a surge of support for parties that support European integration and progressive values. So I think that, you know, it's a fascinating time to study European politics, and I feel optimistic in the medium term. All right, thank you.